This is C-LOG, and this is C-LOG3. But which one should you use? Let's find out. And I'm going to start right now. So firstly, what is log? Well, log is a video picture profile that is designed to capture more dynamic range by giving you a flatter, less saturated image. And this is great when you want to edit your videos and color grade them in post-production. And on modern mirrorless cameras, like my Canon EOS R5, you've actually got two log profiles to choose from. You've got C-LOG as well as C-LOG3. So which one should you choose? Let's find out by comparing the two. Now, when you have a look and compare C-LOG versus C-LOG3 side by side, it's very subtle, but when you have a closer look, you'll notice that C-LOG is a lot more of a saturated profile than C-LOG3. So when you go ahead and color grade both log profiles, C-LOG becomes very saturated very quickly versus C-LOG3, where C-LOG3 holds those natural colors a lot better. C-LOG3 also offers you a more natural contrast curve, holding a little bit more information in the highlights and shadows. You can see this when you go ahead and zoom into the shadow regions, where it goes from light to dark a lot smoother. This will make your image look a lot more natural and help you preserve the image when you push and manipulate the colors when editing and color grading your video. Now, the base ISO of C-LOG3 is actually one stop higher than standard C-LOG. Standard C-LOG has got a base ISO of ISO 400, where C-LOG3 has got a base ISO of 800. So if you compare them side by side, if we look into the shadows, C-LOG3 at its native ISO contains just a pinch more grain than standard C-LOG, but this really depends on the type of camera you're shooting with. My Canon EOS R5, there's very little grain to begin with in both profiles, but out of the two, C-LOG does contain just a little bit less grain in the shadow regions. But if you're shooting on an older camera or even a newer camera, you might notice the grain is a little bit more subjective, so it really depends on the type of camera you're shooting with. Now, because C-LOG3 has got a higher native ISO of 800, you are going to need a stronger neutral density filter to combat the amount of light reaching the sensor. If you shoot at both the same shutter speed, aperture and ISO, you're letting in double the amount of light with C-LOG3 to expose it correctly. So you are going to need a stronger neutral density filter to actually use C-LOG3 versus standard C-LOG. Now, when we look at the dynamic range of both C-LOG and C-LOG3, C-LOG3 does contain that little bit more information in both the highlights and shadows, offering up to 12 stops of dynamic range at its base ISO, where C-LOG only offers 11 stops of dynamic range. To be honest with you, there's not a lot in it, but that little extra stop of light might help you expose for both the highlights and shadows and give you a little bit more of a smoother contrast when you've got shadow fall off or highlights. So with colors and color representation to get the most natural colors possible, C-LOG3 will give you a little bit more room to wiggle around with when color grading, just thanks to that extra stop of dynamic range. Now, when it comes to exposing for C-LOG and C-LOG3, you do have to treat them slightly differently. C-LOG, you pretty much want to nail that exposure at 0 EV. You'll find that you'll retrieve a good amount of information in the highlights and shadows. It gives you a good amount of flexibility in post, where C-LOG3, you want to ever so slightly overexpose it by around 1 to 2 stops, but no more. You'll find that it's easier to retrieve that information in the highlight regions than the shadow regions. So you want to slightly overexpose it so you can basically not add so much grain into the shadow areas. Where with C-LOG, because it's fairly balanced, you want to make sure that you're pretty much nailing that exposure straight out of camera. So out of the two, it is slightly easier to expose for C-LOG, although it's not difficult to expose for C-LOG3. So which one should you use? Well, C-LOG3 does give you a little bit more dynamic range, offering up to 12 stops versus just 11 stops with C-LOG. So if you are shooting in fairly harsh sunlight, you will have a little bit more information in the highlights and shadows with C-LOG3 versus just standard C-LOG. C-LOG3 is also prone to less clogging up the shadow regions. Because you have to slightly overexpose it to get the best color, you'll find that the shadows don't get clogged up or they don't get muddy at all. Where I find it's more prone to get more muddy shadow areas in C-LOG than C-LOG3. So out of the two, for retrieving information in the shadow regions, C-LOG3 is far better. And lastly, I do find C-LOG3 easier to color grade. I find you can manipulate the colors and exposure a lot more thanks to that little bit of extra stop of dynamic range, as well as it being a less saturated image. So applying colors and manipulating colors are far easier. C-LOG is still nice to edit, but C-LOG3 just gives you that little bit of extra flexibility. So out of the two, which one do I recommend shooting in? Well, me personally, I recommend shooting in C-LOG3, and it gives you many benefits over standard C-LOG. Firstly, it gives you a less saturated image, so it's easier to manipulate and change the colors when color grading your videos in post-production, as well as it gives you one stop extra of dynamic range, so it's easier to retrieve some of that information in the highlights and shadows, and I find it's less prone to muddying the shadows in post-production. But of course, write down in the comments what you guys prefer shooting in. Do you like shooting in C-LOG or the newer C-LOG3 color profile? Make sure to write it down in the comments below. I've been James for Video Fever, and I'll catch you guys next time.